How goes it? We'll talk about Domestic Violence Awareness Month. There's a great event going on that will introduce you to the person behind it. A great program is helping kids with education, and it's election season, of course. Let's start with that. Roll it, Scott. Louisiana go together like red beans and rice. So let's get down into it. With the election happening this weekend, John Couvillion with JMC Analytics is here to talk about this election cycle that's been kind of, a little blah.
Low wattage.
Low wattage. So let's start at the top of the ticket. Obviously, the governor's race is up. John Bel Edwards, our longtime governor, is leaving office after 2 terms, 8 years, and you've got a cadre of candidates running to unseat him, and it looks like the outcome is inevitable, that Jeff Landry, either in a miracle finish in a runoff, or in the primary, or after the runoff, will be the next governor of the state of Louisiana. What about that?
So the way I look at the governor's race is this, is that there is a minimal, and I want to emphasize minimal, chance that Jeff Landry would win without a runoff, because the data I'm seeing does not yet show that he's getting the numbers he needs to win with 51% Saturday night. But it's not impossible given that nobody else has taken off. So yes, I forecast that he and Shawn Wilson will be the #1 and #2 finisher. The other challengers I think of as probably being in the high single digits, and I'm talking about Stephen Waguespack, Hunter Lundy, and John Schroeder.
Doesn't this look similar to the governor's race 2 cycles ago when you had David Vitter running against other Republicans, Scott Angel, Jay Darden, and then you had the Democrat, John Bel Edwards, that no one knew, who came in and was able to win? At that time, Vitter had extremely high negatives based upon things that have gone on. Landry has some negatives, but not that high. To what do you attribute his ability to just cruise into this without even having to debate with other candidates about his platform?
So what's interesting about what you're describing is, I think the Democrats would like to think this is David Vitter Part 2. There's several crucial differences. Number one, you don't have a Shawn Wilson who's triangulating and talking about his position on abortions and guns and so forth. So in other words, he hasn't really done what's necessary to appeal to more conservative voters. Number two, I think Democrats overestimated the dislike people have against Jeff Landry. That probably is more of an inside the I-110 beltway kind of thing as opposed to the average voter. Number three, the thing that Jeff Landry has done, which I think has been smart of him, is he has focused all crime all the time, has been his campaign messaging. And lately that has been a winning message, whether here, New York, or in other states, is focusing on crime. And so I think that's what makes this election a little bit different than the contours of the 2015 race.
You know, Shawn Wilson, Dr. Shawn Wilson, is a very likable man, has been around for a long time in government, Secretary of DOTD. I thought that there would be more energy coalesced around him as a candidate. Educated African-American male who doesn't have any scandal tied to him. Why hasn't that taken off?
Several things. Number one, I think he's not made the effort to triangulate himself in the way that John Bel Edwards has. Number two, the problem with being the quote-unquote educated candidate is this. It reminds me of the time back in 1952 when a lady was talking to Adlai Stevenson and said, well, you're the smartest person alive. I think you should win. And Adlai Stevenson said, I know, ma'am, but I need a majority. So the challenge that Shawn Wilson has is this. In my opinion, when I see his campaign commercials, I think of him talking about esoteric type topics as opposed to talking about bread and butter. Like, for instance, you know, the Garvey bonds, which helped pave I-10 in Ascension Parish and or St. Martin Parish, that was my brainchild.
Yeah.
In other words, talk about things like that as opposed to peace, love, and unity.
Well, and you know, you think about what he did, you look at other areas of the state where the roads are a lot better than what we deal with here in EBR, but it helps on the way with the infrastructure package that was passed a couple of years ago by the Biden administration. Let's talk about these constitutional amendments, and we may circle back to these races. There are 4 on the ballot for you this weekend. One that deals with protecting elections and excluding foreign organizations or non-governmental operatives from investing in elections either on the state level or on the municipal level. The second deals with strengthening religious protections in the state of Louisiana with a wrinkle that we'll get to in just a moment. The third deals with pay for or retirement for Teachers, school employees, Louisiana State Police, state employees. Right now, in the surplus, the state is required to spend a minimum of 10% on retirement. This change would raise that to 25%. And then the fourth deals with nonprofits that own blighted properties. The state would have the ability, or municipalities would have the ability, to strip them of their property tax exemption. Long-winded explanation, you're welcome. So let's talk a little bit about the one that jumps out to you.
The one that's most interesting to me, well, it's kind of a tie, being that I have a financial background, the one about the retirement system debt, because that's one of those I could take 10 segments talking about, you know, we're paying for the sins of the past by not adequately funding our retirement systems, et cetera, et cetera. This amendment attempts to correct that. But the one that from the sexy standpoint is the one that you and I would love to talk about is the one about the religious freedom, so to speak. And
give me another minute there, Scott. Add 1 minute. So this one is a Louisiana special.
Yes.
So you have this amendment that says it strengthens the ability to worship in a church or a house of worship and raises the state's ability to protect those. But deep down in the details, there is a provision that would allow the state, in the case of, say, God forbid, another COVID, to say, shut it down because it's at risk to the public or the lives of people in an area.
So when I was reading this,
is there a name that comes to mind?
Tony Spell.
That's right.
So when I was reading this amendment, the first thing that came to mind was, you remember going back in the days, early days of the pandemic, when we had strict occupancy limits, really stricter than almost anywhere else in the Deep South.
Yeah.
Well, you had an ongoing battle between Reverend Tony Spell and Governor John Bell Edwards regarding the occupancy limits of his church. And so my suspicion is this amendment was born out of the back and forth that was going on and the law enforcement getting called in and that. Because if you start talking about topics like strictest constitutional scrutiny, all that, you're basically saying, hey, government, you can't touch this anymore. And so I think that is the intent of that amendment, is basically saying you can't play the game with occupancy limits to churches if there were ever another pandemic.
Brother, we call our counties parishes here. I think we're okay with religion. What about the other statewide races? Anything pop out to you in the last 45 seconds?
The thing that's interesting to me would be the Secretary of State's race, because you have a credible case of 2 out of 5 plausible candidates who could make the runoff, and you could basically think of almost any combination of those 5, including possibly 2 Democrats.
It'll be interesting. So JC's coming back next week so we can do an after action on how this weekend goes. Quickly, what do you think the turnout's going to be?
38 to 40%.
38 to 40%. We'll hold him to that and see about it next week. How does EBR become safe, healthy, and hopeful? Got one of the bosses from downtown to tell you about that next.